I love APS's commitment to science and teaching, so it's a real honor for me to be here. And it's also a real honor for me to give this talk in honor of Dave Myers, who's really one of my heroes. I mean, Dave has really influenced me in so many ways. And in particular, Dave has inspired me in 3 ways, which I'll go through. Number 1, Dave wrote the most successful intro psychology book ever written, and deservedly so. It is a phenomenal book that has inspired at least 2 generations of psychology students, inspired me when I was an undergraduate. I'm sure it's going to inspire many more people in the coming generations. And Dave, in part, actually inspired me, along with my co-authors, to co-write an intro book of our own. And if our book is 1/10 as influential and impactful as Dave's book, I will be amazingly delighted. Number 2, Dave has influenced me by his office. You look at Dave's office, and every book, every paper is in its proper place. It's utterly immaculate, impeccable. And that's really one aspect that I've really tried to emulate very hard in my career, as you can see here. It's really something I've worked very hard on in my career and failed miserably. Number 3, and I think more apropos of this talk, Dave wrote a wonderful book, tremendous book, in my view, a little better than a comparable book by this fellow named Gladwell, called Intuition, which is just a tremendous book. And I think in some ways this book dovetails very nicely with the theme of my talk, because in this book Dave talks, I think, very eloquently about intuition and how intuition serves very important roles, how it can be very useful, but also how it can mislead us about the nature of the world if we're not careful. And in some ways, that's really what my talk is all about. Let me tell you just a bit about my own background. By way of background, I've taught intro psychology or been involved in teaching intro psychology at actually 4 different universities. So first at my wonderful alma mater, Cornell University, where actually I taught a couple of sections of intro psychology, real small as an undergraduate. Then as a grad student at University of Minnesota, there's lovely Elliott Hall at University of Minnesota, where Dean Morey, one of my friends, and I spent a lot of time. So I actually taught intro psychology 3 times there as a grad student. Then SUNY Albany, where I began my faculty job. I like putting that one up with snow, because that's all I remember from SUNY Albany is snow. That's my only recollection. The rest of it's all a blur, but that's what Albany looks like. And then more recently at my home, Emory University, there's our beautiful new psych department where I've taught since 1994. So I've been teaching intro psychology for a long time, and I have to say up until maybe about a decade ago or so, I think I embraced what I'm going to call, a bit provocatively perhaps, the modal approach to teaching intro psychology. And I'm going to simplify things here just a little bit, but the modal approach is exemplified by this fella here. So, okay, this is going to get us all really depressed, right? People, a few gray hairs are going to be depressed by this. How many people remember, show of hands, Joe Friday? Sergeant Joe Friday. Okay, not so bad. Okay. I did a quick mental t-test. It's significant, large effect size in terms of age. I noticed a slight difference there. But Sergeant Joe Friday, for those people who don't remember him, was famous for Just the Facts. Man, he was a show Dragnet. That's what I always say to people when they get hysterical after crime. Just the facts, man. And in general, the Joe Friday approach, as I'm calling it, highlights facts and figures. That's what I pretty much all taught when I taught intro psychology for many years. Key principles, key findings of psychology, which of course, let's face it, are really important. Every student has to come out understanding what classical conditioning is, what working memory is, and so on. It focuses on well-established knowledge, which is of course important, the body of knowledge produced by good psychological science. It emphasizes what there's strong evidence for, but it does not typically, at least modally, emphasize what there is strong evidence against. So a number of years ago, we began embarking on a project to write an intro psychology book that actually was a bit unconventional because it tried to distinguish science from pseudoscience. So there was a lot of pop psychology there, a lot of pseudoscience. And one reviewer took umbrage with our approach, did not like it, said pseudoscience does not belong in the psychology classroom, hence the rather subtle title of my talk. Doesn't belong in an intro psych book. So he or she wrote, I want my intro psychology textbook to look like an intro chemistry textbook. And I think in some ways that's sort of a modal view. But to me, I think there's a key difference between intro psychology and intro chemistry, which is that intro psychology really is at what Hal Kelly called the meso level of understanding, which is kind of the level at which we typically operate. We have conceptions, we have misconceptions about ourselves, about the nature of the world, and our students do too. Our students do not typically, although actually they do to some extent, actually. There is a literature on misconceptions about chemistry, but they don't typically come into their chemistry classes with massive misconceptions about what quarks are. However, they do come into their psychology classes with massive misconceptions about the nature of love, dreams, and memory. So I would argue that we actually have to take a somewhat different approach, although even if I were teaching chemistry, I would probably adopt some of this approach too, but we have to adopt a somewhat different approach to the softer sciences than the more traditional hard sciences. So I think there are a couple of potential dangers or perils of the Joe Friday approach. I'm going to argue very soon that students come into their intro psychology classes chock full of misconceptions, misinformation about psychology, as well as a variety of beliefs that lack strong evidence. Of course, with the rise of the internet, the early 21st century has not just become an information explosion, it's also become a misinformation explosion in a big way. So students inevitably are going to be exposed to increasing amounts of pseudoscience and other junk science on the internet. And as a result, students may not learn, if you just adopt the Joe Friday approach, as I'm calling it, to distinguish well-supported claims from poorly supported claims. And I think it's safe to say that the modern world, the landscape of the modern world is in many ways really affected by pseudoscience and otherwise questionable claims. It's hard to go anywhere without seeing questionable claims somewhere, whether it's the animal world, the medical world, the religious world, the political world, or in my own home case, the world of psychotherapy. Alan Crowd, I don't know if Alan's here, but Alan kind of to lend me this slide a number of years ago. He tried to convince me that she ate the dolphin. I don't know if that's true, but maybe that's how, I don't know. But you know, in some ways, these are the easy claims. I think the more difficult ones are the ones that are subtler. These are the ones that maybe fall more traditionally under the landscape of pseudoscience, the ones that may seem scientific on the surface but are not, like subliminal self-help tapes, neurolinguistic programming. Many of these have the cachet or patina of science because they often invoke scientific concepts even though they're not particularly scientific. Now, we would hope that the media would be helpful in this regard, wouldn't we? We would hope that the media would help us to distinguish science from pseudoscience. Sometimes, in all fairness, it does. Other times, maybe less so. So if the media does not understand the difference between astrology and astronomy, we're in big trouble. And oftentimes the media perpetuates misunderstandings about science and pseudoscience. Now, why is this important? Well, if we look at polls of the general public, as well as polls of students, we see that questionable beliefs, poorly supported beliefs, are quite widespread. Here's some data from a fairly recent Harris poll of the U.S. general public. 71% of people claim to have had a paranormal experience, 34% believing in ghosts, 56% believing in ghosts or spirits of the dead. By the way, 25% of people believe that one can communicate with the dead. I should say, incidentally, some people have noted talking to the dead is actually not all that difficult. It's getting them to talk back that's the hard part. But 41% believe in ESP, 37% believe that houses can be haunted, 65% believe that Ouija boards can be dangerous, although if anyone saw a talk I recently gave on facilitated communication, there may be a little bit of truth to that, but not in the way that people think. And there's a little cottage industry of studies on misconceptions among psychology students. So here are just some examples. 66%, some of these are a bit old, but the numbers have stayed pretty steady over the years. 66% believe that expressing pent-up anger typically is good and reduces anger. If anything, the data show the opposite, as we know. Strange behaviors, more common during full moons. 65% believe that, again, a completely debunked notion. People with schizophrenia have multiple personalities. 77% of people believe that. I don't even believe that people with multiple personality have multiple personalities, but be that people with schizophrenia certainly don't have multiple personalities. The polygraph test is an accurate detector of lies. 45% believe that. Joe Green's data showing that 44% of students think that hypnotized people act like robots. And blindly follow the suggestions of hypnotists. We know that's not true. 75% of students believe in what's often called the first instinct fallacy, that you should always stick with your original answer, even if another one seems correct. Completely debunked by like 35 different studies, but again, it's very widely held. Now, I think that the standard model, which kind of follows from what I've talked about before, is what I'm calling here the Alka-Seltzer model of education. So what we simply do is we plop our misconceptions into water, plop our misconceptions into standard instruction, and they will just kind of dissolve. So the assumption behind this Alka-Seltzer model is if we expose our students to what there's good evidence for, the well-established findings of psychological science, those misconceptions should disappear, melt away, dissolve. That's certainly what I thought for a number of years. There's actually a bit of a literature on this, and most of the literature suggests that's just not a viable model. So in a number of domains, not just psychology, what has been found is that this standard approach tends not to dissolve, tends not to melt away inaccurate or questionable beliefs. As a result, students may leave their courses with their misconceptions intact, as well as without good scientific thinking skills. Where are the data? Well, there are several studies that have looked at changes in psychological misconceptions, much like the ones I showed you, following standard instruction in intro psychology courses. What those studies show is that the misconceptions do not change very much. The decreases have been between about 5% to 6.5%. In fact, those may even be overestimates because those are pre-post designs, which we know are inflated by practice effects and so on. So it's not a very pretty picture. What that means is students come in believing certain false things about psychology, come out typically believing those same false things. The decreases are even lower among the more poorly performing students, who we also know are actually more prone to these misconceptions, which is even more worrisome. Some examples: even after intro psychology courses, some studies show that about a third of students believe that people use only 10% of their brains, and that people with schizophrenia have multiple personalities. That's 30% of people after intro psych instruction. And interestingly, and this is a bit of a side note, and this, if anyone saw David Dunning's fine talk yesterday on metacognition, relates potentially a bit to this. There's actually some data, and we are able to replicate this a little bit in a new study that Alan Bensley and I did, showing that there's actually a bit of evidence that students are actually more confident about the misconceptions than they are about accurate beliefs, at least some data, which is also quite worrisome. So here's one striking example some of you may be familiar with. There's a literature on extramission beliefs. So this is quite remarkable body of literature conducted by a research team at Ohio State in education. So a larger portion of individuals, including college students, by the way, believe that visual perception involves the emission of tiny little particles or rays from the eyes. That when we're perceiving something, tiny little things come out of our eyes and meet with those objects. Piaget actually observed that many children hold that belief, and that there's kind of a residue, Piaget argued, even to adulthood. So, and studies have looked at this, by the way, multiple times, and you see this, for example, in Superman's X-ray vision. You can actually ask people through self-report. You can actually show them on a computer screen, are there particles coming out? They will actually happily draw the particles emanating from the eyes and meeting the objects. Obviously, we know that is false. That's not the way vision works. Well, guess what? Guess what? Even after students have been exposed to several lectures on nothing but the human eye, they still believe it. It doesn't change at all. The beliefs continue to persist, which is pretty remarkable. The authors say, here's an important implication: students continue to leave their courses with a profound misunderstanding about vision, and they're right. And more broadly, I would argue, you may see a similar pattern for many other kinds of psychological misconceptions. There is, though, some potential reason for optimism, but some cautious reason for optimism. There are some data from psychology and other fields on what are called refutational approaches. In a refutational approach, what you do is you actually have to activate the misconception, bring it out from under the shadows, talk about it openly, and then explain to students why it is wrong. But you have to bring it out explicitly. And at least for extramission beliefs, that approach does seem to work in the short term. Long term, You ask people 6 months later, it has some effect, but not as pronounced, which maybe I'll come back to later. Kowalski and Taylor similarly found that a refutational approach seemed to be effective for debunking myths. Actually, here the increases were a lot larger, over 50%, although again, the results were short-term, soon after the class was over. We don't know how yet to produce long-term changes in these beliefs. That's still an open and important question, and I'll try to come back to it if I have time. So this brings us to the broader question of what pseudoscience is. And I'm going to simplify things here a bit. There's a lot of interesting philosophy of science about pseudoscience, whether there's a clear demarcation point between science and pseudoscience. I don't believe there is, and we don't need to revisit the whole demarcation problem. But I'd like to argue that by and large, pseudoscientists are imposters of science. They seem scientific. They have the cachet of science. They look like the real thing, but they ain't the real thing. So I would argue they're fake sciences, not false sciences. There's some interesting debate there. Some people would argue that pseudoscientific claims can simply be reduced to claims for which there isn't strong evidence. That's an interesting argument. We've argued that it's a little bit broader than that. These are sciences that clearly are false, but also are fake, and that they can fool people into thinking, including thoughtful people, into thinking they're false. But clearly, I think most of us would agree that the distinction between science and pseudoscience is fuzzy. It's not clear-cut. One model that many people have adopted, ourselves included, is more of a family resemblance model that demarcates science from pseudoscience. So, of course, a chair being a great example of a family resemblance concept. There's no one single defining feature, either necessary or sufficient, that characterizes all of these chairs. And I sometimes do this in my intro class and drive my students crazy because I try to throw out oh yeah, all chairs have 4 legs. No, they don't. You can sit on a chair. Well, you can sit on a table. I don't know. So you can go, but we recognize all of those quite clearly as chairs without any difficulty because they share a family resemblance. Pseudosciences, we have argued, are much the same. So one can, at least in principle, delineate some very rough warning signs, fallible indicators that characterize pseudoscience. This is actually a nice slide put together by a student who worked a bit in our lab, Rachel Amorati. So here's some common differences, although if you believe a family resemblance model, this may imply that such a list can never be truly comprehensive or exhaustive because it's what Pat called an open concept, which is kind of indefinitely extendable. That's one potential model. But in pseudoscience, we tend to see more extraordinary claims that are not backed by evidence. And again, bear in mind, we're talking about differences of degree and kind here. We certainly sometimes see some of the same claims in science as well. Some extraordinary claims in science happen to be true. But in general, they're supported by compelling evidence. Pseudosciences are often characterized by an over-reliance on testimonial, anecdotal experiences. As we know, the plural of anecdote is not fact, but pseudoscience is often treated that way. We often see an emphasis more on authority figures. In my own field of clinical psychology, what is sometimes jokingly called eminence-based practice as opposed to evidence-based practice. Eminence-based practice is often, it gets you along okay. A lot of fields of medicine kind of work in terms of eminence-based practice, but in general, that's not the ideal model for how science should work. We see an emphasis on confirmation rather than falsification, typically, which is not ideally the way science should work. We often see use of imprecise or obscurantist terms in pseudosciences. We often see a stagnation of claims that do not change very much in response to new evidence. Again, I don't want to exaggerate this because sometimes in science we see some of the same stagnation too, but in pseudosciences it's particularly pronounced. We often see an evasion of the peer review process in many pseudosciences, and we often see an overuse of ad hoc explanations. Again, ad hoc explanations have an important role in science. It's not that ad hoc explanations are always wrong. They play a valuable, in fact, invaluable role, but in general, in sciences, ad hoc explanations tend to increase the theory's predictive content and predictive power. And pseudosciences, oftentimes, they're just pasted on in a desperate attempt to rescue the claims from falsification. So in the second half of the talk, I want to talk about different psychological sources of pseudoscientific belief. And I think these are, in my view, very important to expose students to, because I think for students to really grasp what pseudoscience is and why it's important, they also need to understand why they themselves, and why, by the way, all of us, myself included, are prone to pseudoscience. And this is, I think, a key point, which is that pseudoscientific beliefs are widespread. We all have them. I've held them over the years. I'm sure I still have some beliefs that are pseudoscientific. And they spring, many people have argued, from, in essence, the same psychological sources as do correct and adaptive beliefs. They're cut from the same cloth as many other people before me have argued. So I think when one does teach students about these beliefs, I would argue it's very important, and I've learned this over the years, I think, to try to avoid an us versus them mentality, because we're all prone to these false beliefs. We all are. And they stem from basically adaptive psychological sources that oftentimes are actually pretty useful. It's just sometimes they can be misused. So there are undoubtedly multiple sources of pseudoscientific beliefs, but I'm going to talk about 5 here. I'm not going to talk about motivational factors, although those are exceedingly important. Hope springs eternal. There's no question that motivational factors play a huge role in pseudoscience. I'm not going to say too much about that, other than to say that we know from a lot of psychological research that motivated cognition is a powerful force behind maladaptive and inaccurate beliefs. A lot of the cognitive factors, if not all of them, can be spurred on by the motivation to believe. But here I'm going to focus primarily on cognitive factors, although I will sometimes talk about how they intersect. By the way, one other point I'll make is that these 5 factors themselves are not entirely independent. They themselves intersect in a number of interesting ways. I'm going to talk about them as independent for expository purposes, but when it comes to particular beliefs, you will see that they often co-occur. So number 1, naive realism, a term imported from philosophy by psychologists like Lee Ross and others. The belief that the world is precisely as we see it. Of course, there are a host of terms in the English language that attest to the power of naive realism. Seeing is believing. I saw it with my own eyes, and so on. And as we all know, the best rebuttal to naive realism are visual illusions. So Ed Adelson's remarkable checkerboard illusion, the A and B squares on that checkerboard are identical in illumination. Of course, I can look at that slide 10,000 times and say, there's no way that's possible. This one even more remarkable. This one was making the rounds a couple of months ago, a variant of the checkerboard illusion, but those 2 tablets are actually identical in illumination. Actually, I have to confess, when I first saw it, I had to cut it out myself to convince myself, but they are. Of course, Shepard's tables, wonderful illusion, courtesy of Roger Shepard. Those 2 tabletops are superimposable on each other, exactly identical. I mean, again, a very powerful rebuttal to naive realism. And of course, the phenomenon of induced movement. Those of you sitting in the middle can probably get this one. If you stare in the middle of that slide, you're going to see yourself pulled into that tunnel. A beautiful illusion, even though the slide itself is, of course, stationary. How is this relevant to pseudoscience? Well, Jenny McCarthy. Well, in fairness to Jenny McCarthy, in fairness to her, she has a son who's been diagnosed with autism. That diagnosis has been recently questioned, but there's at least some variant of autism that he has. She, of course, believes that autism is caused by vaccines, but also she believes autism can be treated, and she has treated Evan through a variety of rather unconventional interventions, antifungal interventions, antiviral interventions, gluten-free diets, casein-free diets, detox methods. And according to her, he has improved. And in an interview, she was asked, how do you really know? And a reporter asked her pretty legitimate, well, how do you know these techniques are working? I mean, how do you really, but the science doesn't support these techniques. Most of them are either unstudied or the ones that have been studied have been found not to work. How would you know? And her rebuttal to the reporter is, in fairness, I think something that a lot of people out there probably believe. What she said is, I don't need science. My science is Evan. That's her son. That's my science. That's what I saw him changing with my own eyes. He's home. I gave him the techniques, I gave him these procedures, he's home, he got better afterwards. That's all I need. That is naive realism at its best or worst, depending on one's perspective. But I think it's actually a more widespread assumption than we often think. In the domain of psychotherapy, we see some of the same thing, right? In psychotherapy, we've got this before and after, right? So our client comes in, upset, we wait 6 months, 6 weeks, the person is better. We're seeing the change with our own eyes. Our naive realism is telling us the person has improved. In fact, the person probably often has improved, but we're forgetting about all of the background factors that may be less immediately obvious to us, partly because we can observe the client's improvement, we can't directly observe regression to the mean or placebo effects or things like that. So as a result, we may draw the erroneous conclusion that it's actually our treatment that's responsible for the improvement when it may have nothing to do with that treatment. Number 2, what Michael Shermer has called patternicity. We tend to perceive patterns even when they are absent. The human mind is a pattern-seeking organ, and many people have argued, and I think this makes a lot of sense, that our minds, our brains may be, I don't think hardwired, I think very little is hardwired personally, but may be soft-wired, predisposed toward false positive errors. This has often been called adaptive conservatism. We have a strategy of better safe than sorry. So if we're walking through the forest and we come upon, whoa, what's that? It looks, at least at first glance, you're making a quick turn, maybe a little bit like an animal or a snake or something. We may jump. We may assume, well, maybe that's a snake, even though it's just a weird configuration of a root or a twig. Well, again, that's probably not a bad mistake to make. It's much better, many people have argued, to make false positive errors than to make false negative errors. So as a result, we may tend to perceive patterns in the world as an adaptive feature of the way our minds work, but as a result, we sometimes can be fooled as a consequence if we're not careful. So our minds often form associations between, in essence, unrelated events quite naturally. And we actually even form direct connections between, a great example of the Gestalt law of good continuation, by the way. Our minds will forge these connections across unrelated events. And this is well known in the phenomenon of pareidolia, perceiving images in essence meaningless stimuli. This seems to be particularly marked for faces. My colleague Danny Dilks has done some nice work in this, showing that really early on, even a few days after birth, infants seem to have an innate predisposition toward face recognition that clearly is still something that there's a powerful residue of us in adults. By the way, a little interesting piece of trivia here many people don't know about. Richard McNally, my friend at Harvard, I'm sure knows about this. B.F. Skinner developed an auditory projective test. Yes, he did. I'm not making this up, which later became the tautophone. He actually was interested in this and was able to show that people will actually misperceive various voices and sentences in auditory stimuli. There's actually a fascinating article on that if people are interested. So here are some of my personal favorite examples of pareidolia. You can get a lot of these on the web, by the way. So, there's the angry bag. Some of you, by the way, may have experienced the embarrassing phenomenon of windshield pareidolia. I have no idea what that is, by the way, but it kind of freaks me out. But then, of course, there's the famous nun bun. Someone found this in Nashville, Tennessee, not too far from Vanderbilt University. And one of the great disappointments of my life, I was giving a talk actually at Belmont University, which is not too far from Vanderbilt, and they knew I was interested in this stuff. So they said, oh, by the way, the bakery that had the nun bun is only a few blocks from campus. So we went over there to see it, and it was gone. Someone had abducted the nun bun, which is my operational definition of you need to get a life really badly. And by the way, it was even more embarrassing, but they had a fake nun bun in there. It was like a pseudo nun bun. I don't even know what that means. But because I guess, well, whatever. But this is and by the way, this fetched tens of thousands of dollars. And if you're really into this kind of stuff, by the way, you can get your own pareidolia toaster now on the web. There you go. And people. So in terms of giving rise to pseudoscientific beliefs, many of you have seen this. We'll get back to Mars later. The face on Mars, 1976, the Mars Viking orbiter snapped this remarkable photo in the Cydonia region of Mars that looked amazingly like a human face. It spawned books about alien life on Mars. You can still see hundreds of websites about the face on Mars. About 25 years later, largely at the urging of Carl Sagan, my model for a great scientist, he actually urged NASA to go back to take a look at what was there. And by the way, Sagan did not think there was anything there, but he basically said, let's just find out. First of all, let's silence the damn critics, because I get mail from them every day about the face on Mars. But also, he wanted to say, even if it's a 1 in billion, as you like to say, 1 in billion chance that there's something, let's find out. They did, and as you can see from this photograph, there's nothing there. I mean, there's no evidence for anything. And of course, conspiracy theorists criticized NASA and said they must have covered it up or something, but there's nothing there. It's pareidolia. Related phenomenon, by the way, is apophenia. Sometimes it's lumped together. It's a bit different. This is more detecting meaningful connections among events rather than visual images. Again, pareidolia is almost certainly a major contributor to belief in paranormal phenomena. I often give the example, it's a true one happened to me, of how I was in my first semester of college, feeling guilty that I had not called, this is before the days of email, I had not called one of my best friends. I was thinking about him for a couple of weeks. I kept putting it off, putting it off. I finally, on a Friday night, steeled myself, picked up the phone to call him up, and there was no dial tone. He was on the phone at the same exact moment. At that same exact moment, he decided to call me, and boy, did that scare the hell out of me. It gave me a chill. But when you think about it, of course, it is interesting, but when you think about it, it could just very well be coincidence. We forget about all the times we thought about friends when they didn't call, and conversely, of course, the other cell, all the times when our friends called, we weren't thinking about them. So these kinds of coincidences are almost inevitable, but when they do happen, they're quite striking. Of course, sometimes coincidences can just be kind of cute and engaging, as we see here. Sometimes they're a little less cute and engaging if one happens to be the victim of them. Whoops. But in extreme forms, apophenia can give rise to weird kinds of spooky conspiracy theories. So you have one of these, many of you, in your back pocket right now, the dollar bill. So look at all the times the number 13 mysteriously appears in the dollar bill. You can find all kinds of connections there if you are determined to find them. And of course, in its most extreme form, it can lead to truly bizarre conspiracy theories. This is a poster produced by someone with far too much time on their hands, forging, I don't know if you could see this, but I mean, it's unbelievable. But there are connections there between like CDC over there and McDonald's and CNN. You know, they both have 3 letters, CDC, CNN. What are the odds of that? I don't know. To Osama bin Laden. I mean, again, you can find connections almost everywhere if you're willing to look for them. And a related phenomenon most of you are familiar with is illusory correlation, a phenomenon my poor grad students always hear about because I pound it mercilessly. I think it's a phenomenon every psychology student should know about, the perception of statistically powerful associations between largely or entirely unrelated events. Vaccines and autism, again, a clear-cut example. Sugar and ADHD, a pretty much thoroughly debunked link, but people see that association. Rainy weather and joint pain. Amos Tversky did a study showing there's no association between those two events, although people with arthritis will insist up and down that their pain gets worse when it's humid or rainy. The example I always give that affects me, so I'm prone to illusory correlation too, is running late to work and red traffic lights. When I'm running late to work, running late to a class, it sure seems to me that there are a hell of a lot more red traffic lights than there are other times. Is it possible that the Department of Transportation has engaged in a diabolical plot to keep me running late? It's possible. More likely than not, I'm noticing it more often at those times. And, of course, the famous example, the lunar lunacy effect, a very powerful one. And for those of you who don't know, I've told this joke a couple of times, but it's actually it's an instructive story. There was, if you're curious, a nice meta-analysis of the lunar lunacy effect that came out in Psychological Bulletin. Found a beautiful distribution, leptokurtotic distribution, effect sizes with a mean right at 0. And the authors, so as you probably know, students in the audience probably know this, essentially every review article in psychology ends with the following bland admonition, bland advice: further research is necessary in this area. This is essentially the only article in psychology I've ever read that ended the following way: no further research is needed in this area. Now, what I like to call the Great Fourfold Table of Life illustrates this. Of course, you're much more likely to attend to the upper left-hand cell in the fourfold table. Again, you're making a false positive error. You're remembering that cell better. It is more memorable. It's more interesting. You tell more people about it. So as a result, there is a correlation. I mean, in some ways, the term illusory correlation is maybe a little bit misleading because there actually is a correlation, but it's up here. It's not out there. Your brain is actually computing in a very crude way. It's not computing a Pearson correlation directly, but in essence, it's doing something a little bit like that. So it's overweighting that cell, and as a result, it perceives an association. Number 3, what Michael Shermer calls agenticity, the fact we are prone to seeing intentionality, intentional agents almost everywhere, including cases where it's not there. Deborah Kellum and others have noted that children are promiscuously, as she likes to call it, promiscuously teleological. If you ask a 4-year-old child, why are there clouds? 4-year-olds will give answers like, so it can rain. Can give us rain. Why are there tigers? Oh, so we can see them in the zoo. And what a number of people have argued, Paul Bloom has argued this, and I think he's right, is that there's often a bit of a residue of that teleology even with us as adults. It's hard for us not to see intentional, purposeful agents even when they're not there. So ghosts, I mean, partly ghosts are a function of pareidolia. We know almost certainly that most ghosts and poltergeists are misinterpretations of hypnagogic, hypnopompic phenomena. But I think in part we tend to think ghosts are there. It's hard for us not to think there is something intentional going on here when we hear a voice. And I've had that experience before. I once had a hypnagogic event where I woke up and I heard my voice being called when I was alone in the house. And it was hard, even temporarily. Well, did someone call my name? We're very prone to invoking some kind of intentional agency there. Why is intelligent design theory so popular as a variant of creationism? I suspect, and I'm not the first person to argue this, one reason I think intelligent design theory is so popular is because it seems to be right. It seems intuitive. It seems, if you look at the bacterial flagellum, which is shown here, it looks pretty darn complicated. It is. It's a remarkable masterpiece in some ways. It's incredibly complicated. So it's hard for us to fathom, and some of it, of course, is where the human mind is terrible, utterly terrible at grasping vast expanses of time. That's part of it. But it's hard for us to imagine that this was not somehow designed by some higher power. So again, I think it's very easy to slough off intelligent design theory as evidence of some ignorance on behalf of the American public. And I'm not saying we can't improve it through education, we should, but some of it actually comes quite naturally to the way the human mind works. My colleague Bob Macaulay in philosophy has argued that a lot of this scientific thinking actually is much more natural than other types of thinking. This is actually more of a natural default way of thinking. Scientific thinking is not natural, and that's one key thing we have to remember. Number 4, I don't need to say much about this, confirmation bias, the mother of all biases. This tendency to seek out information consistent with what we believe, deny, dismiss, distort evidence that's not. It's very natural. Again, this results from a positive test-seeking strategy. We often seek out evidence that supports our views. Sir Francis Bacon noted this centuries ago, the general root of superstition, and I would argue much of pseudoscience, is that men, women too, folks, observe where they hit, where things hit. Very famous quote, not when they miss. So people tend to perceive, remember their hits. They tend to forget their misses. We're all prone to that. Look, I'm prone to this too. When I was doing psychotherapy, I'd like to think my recollection of my successful cases and unsuccessful cases was completely accurate. I doubt it was. I think I remembered my successful cases a lot better than my unsuccessful cases. And of course, he also noted the power of memory. A lot of things that don't confirm our suspicions, confirm our hypotheses, tend to fade from memory fairly quickly. Confirmation bias oftentimes is innocuous, but sometimes it can be a bit dangerous too and can lead to false scientific conclusions. And by the way, good scientists, sometimes very good scientists, can also be prone to confirmation bias. This is Percival Lowell looking outside of his telescope around the turn of the century. Lowell, great astronomer, great thinker. But Lowell was fooled. He had read an article that, a couple of articles written about 20, 30 years ago in Italy by Schiaparelli, who noted what he termed were canali on the Martian surface. Unfortunately, those were mistranslated in English as canals. And over a period of time, Lowell fell prey to what some science historians have argued is the most prolonged delusion and most prolonged optical illusion in scientific history. A 20, 30-year optical illusion that kept adding onto itself. So Lowell saw more and more and more canals, and if you look at Mars through a fuzzy telescope, you can kind of imagine seeing things. Of course, the resolution of telescopes wasn't very good back then, so you can sort of see what looks a bit like canals. Eventually, he ended up with over 180 canals with different connections among them. It was actually not until the 1960s when Mariner actually came to Mars that they were finally debunked. But poor Lowell spent decades of his life observing things that were just not there because he expected to see them. In our own field, I think we see some of the same things, a bit more controversially. 1974, the film Sybil appeared based on the book that came out the year before. Sybil, the supposed tale of a woman who had 16 different personalities, which I think now has been pretty thoroughly debunked by Debbie Nathan. I think she probably thought she had 16 different personalities. But before Sybil, there was a wonderful talk by my friend Steve Lynn right before this. There were about 79 reported world cases in the world literature. I actually got to see one of them as a grad student. It was like a big sensation because there was a woman in Minneapolis who had multiple personality disorder, and I got to interview her. It was like, whoa, you got to. Nowadays, if I mention I'm seeing someone with dissociative identity disorder, people go, yeah, you and everybody else, because it's so much more common. Now, after Sybil, people started looking for cases of DID, and they found them in droves. Why did they find them in droves? Partly because of confirmation bias. This is actually from a manual published by the American Psychiatric Association, the other APA, and here are some of the signs and symptoms you're supposed to be looking for in your own clients for DID. So your clients, if they start having things like self-mutilation and phobias, anorexia, mood swings, sexual dysfunction, suicide, and you will quickly notice these as the signs and symptoms of every known psychiatric disorder. So as a result, almost every client who has some kind of psychological stress can now be suspected of having DID. So therapists start asking about DID, they start suggesting memories, they start suggesting identities, and sure enough, some of these personalities, some of these alters start coming out, and we now see a massive, just as Lowell saw his hundreds of canals, we now see thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, according to some proponents like Frank Putnam and Colin Ross, millions of people with DID. I would argue that in most, perhaps even all of these cases, we have inadvertently created psychopathology rather than discovered it. Number 5, bias blind spot. This is a meta-bias of sorts. It's a bias about our biases. Bias blind spot tells us something very powerful that we often forget, which is that we all can readily detect biases in other people, but we're often oblivious to those same biases in ourselves. I often think of these as similar to our accents. When I first moved to Minneapolis and spoke in my New York accent, of course everyone said, "Well, you have a really strong New York accent." Of course, I don't have an accent. You guys have the accent, right? And of course, none of us thinks we have an accent because it's a constant. Mathematically, it's constant. It's not a variable. We don't perceive it. And there's also, I think, an illusion of introspection. Many people have pointed out. Emily Pronin, who really, I think, is the primary person responsible for this wonderful research, I think has made this point, which is that we search our mental banks. We look for some evidence of bias in our heads. We don't find it. We look and look. It's not there. We see it in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves. And that's the powerful thing about bias blind spot. We can easily see evidence of bias in other people, what we think is evidence of bias in other people. We just do not see it in ourselves. Therefore, coming up empty-handed, we conclude that we are free of bias. So as a result of bias blind spot, we can partly compensate for it, just like our side view mirrors compensate for blind spot in our cars, but probably not perfectly. And also as a result of bias blind spot, we often think that we are being objective, but our opponents are not. We often see ourselves as largely fair, largely unbiased, but our opponents as biased. Another consequence of this is we can very quickly, very easily detect intellectual deficits in others, but we're often slow to detect those same intellectual deficits in others. And in the domain of politics, both liberals and conservatives like to think of themselves as unbiased, perhaps holier than thou, and their enemies as biased. Of course, what each side doesn't realize is seeing the world through its own lenses. Both sides inevitably have their biases. Both regular viewers of Fox News and MSNBC undoubtedly have their biases, but because of bias blind spot, they see only typically their opponents as biased, they themselves as objective. So, in closing, 5 minutes, what is science? Well, we think of science as sort of figuring stuff out, right? That's what science is. We often don't think much more about that. But science is more than just figuring stuff out. It's more than a body of knowledge. That's part of what science is. But more fundamentally, as many people have argued, it's an approach to knowledge. As Richard Feynman has pointed out, and Monica Pignani noted this in a talk she just gave, science, as Feynman points out, is bending over backwards to prove ourselves wrong. It's an approach to evidence that does that. Tavris and Aronson have talked about science as a method of arrogance control. Dick McFall, I think, is here in the audience, has beautifully written about science as a prescription for humility, and I think that point is often misunderstood because scientists themselves can be pretty arrogant. And in fact, we know from the work of Greg Feist and others on science and scientists, that oftentimes the most successful scientists are the most hard-driving, the most confident, the most arrogant. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction here, but in fact there is not, because the scientific community will hold their feet to the fire. So I'm not saying scientists themselves are always humble, they're not. But the scientific methodology, which is really a systematic set of tools against error, will keep them humble epistemically, even if they're not personally humble. More formally, I'd argue science is a set of systematic safeguards against confirmation bias and against a lot of the other biases I've talked about here. I've often wondered as an instructor whether or not we would do better in terms of teaching research methods if we first started out by talking about confirmation bias and a lot of these other biases, because a lot of the designs that we use and value, like double-blind designs, fundamentally at their core are safeguards against confirmation bias. That's why we use double-blind designs. And I think a lot of our students, if they truly understood that and got it, they'd be more receptive to learning about research methodology. Charles Darwin, I'm running just a few minutes late, but I'll wrap up very soon. Charles Darwin, to me, was one of the great models, arguably the greatest model for how a scientist should work. Why? Because he was keenly aware of confirmation bias. The term was not coined until 1960 or so, but Darwin was well aware of the concept. Great quote from Darwin, which I can read here. I'd also, during many years, followed a golden rule, namely that whenever a published fact, a new observation of thought came across me, which was opposed to my general results, his then nascent theory of evolution, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once. For I had found by experience, isn't this lovely, found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones. So Darwin understood that if something seemed to run counter to his theory of natural selection, he seemed to have a way of forgetting it. So what did he do? He took copious notes, and he was particularly careful. Anytime he found something that seemed to contradict it, he would actually write that down and try to figure it out. That is a great model for how to conduct science. So why should we teach, circling back and to the beginning, coming full circle, why should we teach pseudoscience in psychology classes? So I'm going to be a bit evangelical here. First, I think it stimulates student interest. Students love to talk about ghosts and ESP and UFOs. They love that, so it's a great way of generating student interest. I also would like to argue, though, for a more comparative approach, which I think is a bit different than the way we often teach psychology. I think for students to truly value science at its core, I think it actually helps them to see what not so good science is. And I think by always comparing good with bad science, it can hopefully allow students to better distinguish well-supported claims from more poorly supported claims. In this way, I think one can use pseudoscience as a foil for teaching scientific thinking. What do I mean by that? I think exposing students systematically to examples of questionable science, pseudoscience, junk science, allows students to better appreciate the value of scientific thinking, which fundamentally, at its core, is an essential safeguard against human error. And when I used to teach abnormal psychology, I would expose students to the history of error in medicine. So we can see here some of the widely used treatments in psychiatry, whether it's twisting treatments, turning treatments, tranquilizing chair, cribs. These were thought to be effective treatments. These are thought to be humane treatments. We look at these today, like the tilting chair, we think these are absolutely barbaric. Of course, it raises the question, will people look back at some of the treatments we're using today in much the same way? Perhaps in some cases they will, but to me this makes the general point that scientific knowledge is always provisional, is always self-correcting, and we learn from our errors. In closing, are there some potential hazards? Yes. I think there's always a danger here that students may come to confuse skepticism, which I think is healthy, with cynicism, which is not healthy. Cynicism is closed-mindedness. Skepticism, by its very nature, is open-minded. Skepticism asks for evidence, insists on evidence, but also keeps an open mind to new claims. It's very important to walk that fine line in your teaching. I think there's also a danger, by the way, that students can come away thinking psychology is BS, that psychology is unscientific, and we don't want that. We want students to understand that psychological science has, in many ways, been our best friend against pseudoscience. It's helped us to debunk these claims, and that without psychological science, we risk descending into pseudoscience. But psychological science is what keeps our field healthy. Finally, there are what are called backfire effects, and there's some recent literature on this some of you may be familiar with. which is there is some evidence that debunking misconceptions can, at least in some cases, result in increases in the prevalence of misconceptions. Norbert Schwartz, for example, has shown that if you tell people simple facts like the flu vaccine produces side effects, and those side effects are often worse than the flu itself. Remember that? That's wrong, okay? They're rarely worse than the flu itself. That's wrong. It's a misconception. Oh, yeah, okay. You test them right afterwards. Yeah, it's a misconception. 6 months later, you actually get a backfire effect where they're more likely to think it's true. So you have to be very careful about that. And there's a great, I'm just going to go through this very quick. There's a wonderful little, I think it's actually available on the web now. It's like a debunking handbook. It was actually based on a great article in Psychological Science in the Public Interest by Lewandowski and colleagues. So you can actually get this. Here's a one-page summary of some of their claims. I'll just go through them very quickly. But these are actually empirically supported conclusions from the literature. Here are 4 that you may want to keep in mind. It's really important to present students with a factual alternative that displaces the myth or the misconception. So we are a narrative-seeking species. We tell ourselves stories. You've got to provide a good story, a better story than the misconception itself. Give them, number 2, give them a warning before the myth. Tell them before, this is a myth. What I'm about to tell you is wrong. So keep that in mind. You may have to mention the myth in your teaching, but don't mention it too much. Mention it and move on, because you want to emphasize good science in your teaching. You want students to understand most of psychology is good science, but there are some mythical beliefs. So mention the myth by all means, but don't overdo it. And also, you may have to show how the myth distorts facts. I think that can actually facilitate depth of processing. Explain to them the myth. Explain to them how people have come to believe it. Explain to them why it seems reasonable, but in fact is false. So we all have a kind of private nightmare as faculty, which is that we're going to teach our students this stuff and they're going to forget it all right? And it's all going to go to waste. I like to argue that does not have to be the case. I think scientific thinking skills are, of course, I'm a little biased here myself, but scientific thinking skills, I think, are invaluable, and I think they're things that students can take with them everywhere, not just in every class, but in their everyday lives. And I'd also like to argue that exposing students to pseudoscience is one powerful way, not the only one by any means, one powerful way of teaching these skills. So in the effort to try to emulate Dave Myers as a great teacher, I will give you 6 simple take-home messages. Number 1, pseudoscience is everywhere. It's widespread in everyday life, so watch out for it. Number 2, many students we know come into their classes holding poorly supported beliefs. You may not be aware of that when you're teaching them, but if you ask them, you will quickly find out they have these beliefs. And you know what? If you're not careful, they're going to leave your classes with those beliefs intact. Do not let that happen to you. Multiple sources, including cognitive biases, number 3, contribute to pseudoscientific beliefs. I think it's very helpful to expose students to all of those sources. Number 4, I'd like to argue that scientific thinking is an essential safeguard against cognitive biases, against human error. Number 5, I'd like to argue that exposing students to pseudoscience can be a valuable way of teaching the value of scientific thinking, as well as enhancing student scientific literacy. And number 6, very importantly, we want skeptics, not cynics. We want people to be open-minded. And we also have to be sure to supply students with better causal narratives than the ones they currently have. You know what? As scientists, we've got better stories than the pseudoscientists. Why? Because our stories have the value of being correct, or at least having a better approximation to the truth. And that, I think, is ultimately the best parting message. I'll end here with a quote from one of my intellectual heroes, Carl Sagan, from the first incarnation of the Wonderful Cosmos series. Science is not perfect. It's often misused. It's only a tool, but it's the best tool we have. Self-correcting, ever-changing, applicable to everything. With this tool, we vanquish the impossible. Thank you very much. Thank you.